your effective tax rate is going to drop significantly. All those expenses that you're incurring on a daily basis, your payroll, again, utilities, rent, all of those things that you can't deduct right now are now deductible. And so I think that's going to make an incredible impact to the industry.
Welcome to A Higher Law, a cannabis podcast from the Dykema Law Firm. I'm your co-host, John Fraser, Michigan team leader of Dykema's Cannabis Group.
And I'm Lance Boldrey, the leader of Dykema's Cannabis Industry Group. For more episodes, you can find us at dykemapodcast.com. That's DYKEMA podcast.com, youtube.com/Dykema Law, or by searching A Higher Law wherever you get your podcasts.
On today's episode, we'll be discussing the recent recommendation from the United States Department of Health and Human Services to reschedule marijuana from a Schedule I drug to a Schedule III drug. We're joined today by Scott Kociensk. Scott is a member in Dykema's tax practice group who regularly works with myself and Lance and the firm's cannabis clients on a wide variety of tax issues, from structuring considerations, mergers and acquisitions, transactional considerations, and a whole lot more. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.
So let's kind of cut right to the heart of it. So in the last couple weeks, the Department of Health and Human Services issued a letter to the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, recommending that marijuana be rescheduled from Schedule I to Schedule III. And some action from HHS had been in the works for some time. President Biden issued a directive to HHS about a year ago to have them explore whether or not marijuana ought to be rescheduled. And finally, HHS has come to their conclusion in going through their analysis and has recommended by letter to DEA that marijuana be rescheduled from Schedule I, which Schedule I, for those who aren't aware, under the Controlled Substances Act, is the most restrictive category. Schedule I controlled substances have no currently accepted medical use, a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision, and a high potential for abuse. And the other types of drugs that you'd find in Schedule I are things like heroin, LSD, and ecstasy. So marijuana being in that category has always been a bit odd. That's where it's been since the CSA was enacted in 1970, to much consternation from the industry and advocates abound. And rescheduling to Schedule III would place it in the realm of the Controlled Substances Act as a substance with a potential for abuse that's less than those in 1 and 2, but abuse may lead to moderate or low physical dependence in high usage. And Schedule III drugs can be prescribed by a physician. And some common examples of Schedule III drugs would be products like Tylenol with codeine, or ketamine, or certain anabolic steroids. So a lot of drugs that I suspect some of our listeners may have been prescribed from time to time in response to a surgery or in other circumstances. So the rescheduling recommendation is a big deal, to put it frankly. And so now DEA has the task of reviewing HHS's recommendation, and they've got to make a decision on whether or not they should accept HHS's recommendation and reschedule marijuana. So Lance, can you walk us through the practical implications of rescheduling?
Sure, to the extent that they're known at this point in time. I think the most important consideration is that this change does not in any way displace state law and would not legalize marijuana per se. It essentially, the best way to look at this, I think, is it moves from a place in the federal regulatory framework where it's among drugs that simply cannot be prescribed by any physician for any purpose, onto a schedule where it can be prescribed. But that's different than being legalized for recreational use or adult use. That's different than being authorized to treat potentially some conditions. There's going to be a lot of, I think, a lot of work that's going to have to be done at the individual state level to make this change meaningful as well. Interestingly, some states, and Michigan's a good example of this, do have provisions that automatically spring into effect if marijuana is rescheduled. And I think that really helps inform the scope of the implications here. In Michigan, good example, Schedule 2, automatically. If cannabis is either rescheduled or descheduled at the federal level. So any movement off of Schedule 1 federally makes marijuana a Schedule 2 substance in Michigan. Even if it's sitting on Schedule 3 at the federal level, and Michigan has its own framework that already sits there in statute that automatically comes into effect and begins regulating medical cannabis in a much different fashion than it does today under Michigan's medical frameworks. So the implications for states like Michigan is that you're going to have sort of this parallel and different regulatory framework. And I think practically what that means is the medical marijuana industry is just going to disappear, except in very, very limited circumstances. It just is going to be too difficult to comply with the Schedule 2 requirements in Michigan. When you have adult use anyway, it just moves the activity there. And so from a state law framework, it affects taxation, how much tax is paid at the point of sale by the consumer. And it also impacts the regulatory oversight to some degree.
So Lance mentioned changes to taxation, and obviously one of the biggest burdens the industry faces is taxation at the federal level, and that's brought about by Section 280E. And we've had discussions on the podcast before about 280E. But Scott, could you give the audience just a quick summary and then discuss how rescheduling might impact Section 280E for the cannabis industry?
Yeah, happy to, John. I think at this point, most people operating in the cannabis space are familiar with 280E and its impact on their effective tax rates. 280E emanates from really a 1980s case dealing with cocaine trafficking, in which the court held that a drug trafficker could take ordinary and necessary business deductions against his trafficking income. Shortly after that case came down, Congress enacted 280E to effectively prohibit those deductions for trafficking in controlled Schedule 1 and 2 controlled substances, basically then eliminating almost all deductions that a drug trafficker would otherwise be able to take, except for basically cost of goods sold. So basically the cost of your inventory is the only thing you would be entitled to deduct.
So Scott, what would rescheduling to Schedule 3 do as far as the financial health and operating margins of these cannabis businesses do?
Oh, well, theoretically, right? They should go, the margins should go way up, right? Because you're, relatively speaking, of course, right? Because you're potentially going from as high as an 80% effective federal tax rate down to something more realistic, right? Even if it's below 40%, just imagine what that can do for your financial viability. I think it should be dramatic for retailers.
Scott, one of the things that we see among not just our clients, but sort of among the industry writ large, certainly some companies with a large and significant retail portfolio seem to be, sort of gambling on the fact that 280E will either be repealed or, in this case, the effect of it eliminated by rescheduling. And so we have plenty of folks we see plenty of folks in the industry that will simply get on tax payment plans with the IRS that are sort of waiting for this to come around so that they can all of a sudden be much more profitable. Do you see any retroactivity to rescheduling in terms of sort of these outstanding tax liabilities that a lot of these companies have run up?
I don't. They we have seen retroactive application of tax law in the past. It's usually within the same tax year. So potentially, right, if say it happened in November of 2023, maybe they make it applicable for the tax year 2023, right? I have not often seen retroactive application of a tax law to prior tax years. That's not to say that it can't or won't happen. It's just it would be outside of the sort of the IRS's MO in that respect.
Well, and here we're not really, the tax code isn't really changing.
Right.
The application of the current
of the rule, right? And that's what I mean. So like retroactive application of a change in, I guess in this case, change of the scheduling. Again, I think because what the IRS tries not to do is discriminate against those folks who are doing something prior in time to future in time, right? So up until today, right, everyone's under the assumption that it is a Schedule 1 and everything that they're doing is subject to 280E. So again, usually the IRS doesn't take a position that again, applying 280E, that they can go actually back, that they'll go back in time and apply it in a different way, because up until that date, it was Schedule 1, and it was, those activities would have been subject to 280. Now, I could be wrong about that, and maybe I'll be surprised by the IRS's position on that. But again, until the day it is actually reclassified or rescheduled in this case, it is subject to 280E. And so I guess I would be surprised to see the IRS take a lenient position on that.
And Scott, to follow up on that, so the change from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, maybe oversimplified, would be that cannabis businesses would go from being taxed on their gross revenue to their gross profit, as most other businesses are, which is a little bit of an oversimplification, but it is, I think, probably generally accurate. Can you talk about, assuming rescheduling occurs, what kind of changes are businesses going to have to anticipate from a tax election standpoint to make sure that they can actually take full advantage of the rescheduling impact and elimination of 280E?
Yeah, so that's a great point, John. And so what we've seen right throughout the industry, particularly, again, I'm going to talk mostly about the retail, just because that's where this is going to take the most impact. We've seen retail set up as or make a C Corp election, whether they're an LLC in making that election or formed as a state law corporation, defaulting to a C corporation for federal income tax purposes. Of course, right, we all maybe we don't all know this, but C corporations are subject to two levels of tax, assuming you're distributing any profit. Once at the corporate level, and that's at the federal level, a flat 21%, and then plus state corporate tax, and then to the extent you're making distributions, you're subject to another level of tax. And most have done this because, again, with a lower corporate rate, the effective tax rate is so high that you're going to want, or the amount of because your deductions are so limited, you have what I call a lot more phantom income. And by having that tax at a lower corporate rate, you're much better off than having that flow through to the individual owners who are, could potentially be taxed at 37%, the high federal rate plus state. And so, yeah, the C Corp has been the go-to for most retail. What the getting out of 280E for cannabis retail owners, you might actually start looking at pass-throughs again, like a normal, ordinary business, right? Take your your clothing store down the street, or your restaurant, right? You might actually start looking towards flow through again for cannabis retailers, and that way, you're not subject to that double level of tax to the extent you're able to make distributions out to the owners. To the extent there are losses that can now be claimed, those are going to flow through to the owners. And so the owners, to the extent there are, paper losses, you're able to take those on your personal return. So we might actually see a shift in that direction. Now, for those folks who are C corps already, there will be some sort of pains when we, in trying to convert that to some sort of flow through entity, and that'll probably, that'll take some analysis on a case by case basis to see what the best strategy is going forward. But I would imagine for new or early stage retailers that we might be looking at forming or otherwise converting to flow through entities like partnerships or S corporations.
And Scott, when should cannabis businesses, whether they're prospective licensees looking to enter this space or existing operators, when should they begin having conversations with a tax attorney or their CPA about the implications of restructuring?
Oh, well, I guess I would say, and I always do with tax matters, the earlier the better, right? So if you're in early stages, I would always suggest that you should be talking to a tax advisor about how you should, under the current regime as we know it and going forward, because maybe there are planning tips to operate in both, right? Operate in a way that's useful right now, while we're in the 280E world, and then post 280E world, in a way that you can do that in a sort of seamless manner. Now, that might take some structuring, planning, and those types of things, but it's potentially possible to operate in sort of on both sides of that. And so I do this. I'd say this in almost all cases when you're talking about planning for tax issues is get in early, because that way you have enough time to plan for that potential outcome.
That's a great point. And Lance, does rescheduling solve the current economic issues that are impacting cannabis businesses in Michigan and beyond? We hear everywhere the market's really tight, margins are tight. It's a very tough industry to be in. What does rescheduling do for current operators?
Well, I think Scott's actually identified really the biggest impact, and that's going to be 280E. It's going to be treatment as a normal business from a tax standpoint, which will give much greater margins, particularly for folks on the retail side. Probably less of an impact, certainly less of an impact for growers and processors and maybe the rest of the industry. But on the retail side, it should make a significant difference. What's less than clear, and what's always less than clear in this industry, as anybody who participates in this industry knows, is sort of the ripple effect of what that change may have with respect to, for example, banks' willingness to enter this space. Presumably they're still going to have to comply with the existing FinCEN guidance. That doesn't really change, because you're still talking about businesses that are going to be trafficking in a controlled substance outside of a legal framework when we're talking about adult use, and really the majority of cannabis business activity in the United States. But if it sort of loosens the reins on capital, on banks participating in the space, et cetera, that's a huge positive. What it actually does, by leaving state laws in place, I think it's a relatively limited impact and somewhat predictable on the retail side. What becomes much less predictable is what happens if and when a federal regulatory framework comes to pass. Certainly, big tobacco, big alcohol. There are companies out there already that have been very, very active in lobbying the Congress to say either we now support cannabis regulation, or if you're going to legalize, do it this way, where we have a very strong federal oversight and federal licensing framework that may be incredibly difficult for many current industry participants to make the necessary changes to come into compliance with whatever that federal regulatory framework is going to look like. If we've got a federal change that really does defer to states and allow states to have the primary authority, then that's, I think we see more investment capital flow in, but we're less likely to see an industry become completely captured by the Altrias and Constellation brands of the world.
And I think too, to kind of circle back too on just the economic impact in the short term, right? Retailers are the end of the supply chain, right, for the industry. That's where, the customers pay for the products, and the revenue should flow up all the way back up the supply chain. And if retailers are healthier financially, my cautious, naive, capitalistic optimism suggests that those, that additional cash flow should start making its way back to the growers, processors, all the folks that you hear about in the industry. Everybody's complaining about vendors not paying. If there's more cash that's available for payment of vendors at the retail level because of the ease of the tax burden, while 280 may not directly impact growers and processors, maybe it'll flow through indirectly in that way.
Yes, and to the extent that it incentivizes, banks and others to provide more traditional lending opportunities, borrowing opportunities for industry participants. If we could get to a point here where we're no longer seeing every cannabis business loan in the 18 to 22% interest range, or other sort of punitive provisions in loan agreements, we could have a much more healthy economic environment for the industry as a whole.
And so let's talk a little bit now about, we've talked about what rescheduling is. We've talked about implications. We've talked about the upsides and some of the downsides. What are the odds that this actually goes through? And the chatter in DC, the rumor mill is robust that, it's a matter of when, not if, DEA will reschedule. Like all things federal cannabis-related rumor, I have become a gross skeptic on everything. And while DEA generally must defer to HHS on their conclusions on matters of science and health, DEA still has to look at rescheduling in the context of legal and policy questions. And an obstacle that DEA has faced in the past is that the United States is a party to the UN's Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which is an international treaty. And Section 811 sub D sub 1 of the Controlled Substances Act requires DEA to schedule drugs in a manner that makes sure the U.S. is compliant with its treaty obligations. And because the U.S. is still party to this UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the DEA's historic position has been that marijuana must remain in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 to be in good standing with the treaty. So one thing I know I'm very interested to see, if the rumor mill is believed to be true and it turns out the DEA reschedules, is how they navigate through the fact that their historic position has been, we can't reschedule because we're going to point to our required compliance with respect to this treaty issue, and that's something that remains to be seen.
Well, and I think one of the points that's worth noting there too is we are all very, very familiar with DEA's position when it comes to Delta 8 or other cannabinoids, or how the industrial hemp legislation and framework actually should play out. I don't know that I would conclude that DEA has hewed too closely to questions of the law or proper legal interpretation in the past. And certainly from a policy standpoint, DEA has been and continues to be very anti-marijuana. It's frankly one of their reasons for being in the very first place. At least on the policy side of things, certainly the tenor of an administration is going to have a real effect. And I think that's one of the other things to be concerned about here long term is that all of the fear that the industry had several years ago when former President Trump appointed Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. There was sort of that fear of, gee, this administration could absolutely turn around and try to crush this industry. I don't know that anyone can say with certainty that the next presidential administration is going to hew to a similar position, even if it's the same individual reelected or elected to the White House. Consistency is not necessarily something you always see at the federal level. So there does have to be some concern that this policy recommendation could be reversed in the future as well.
And that's a great point. And practically speaking, what would the timeline look like, assuming DEA finds a way around this treaty obligation? What would the timeline look like, Lance, for any rescheduling activity?
Yeah, so if DEA actually does reschedule marijuana to Schedule 3, and presumably if they do deschedule as well, it requires notice and comment rulemaking under the Federal Administrative Procedures Act. That is not an instant process. There are public hearings that are required. There's an opportunity for every interest group under the sun to weigh in. It is not uncommon for even administrative priorities of an administration to take months to years to get through rulemaking, and it's not uncommon to see those rules then get challenged legally after the fact. I mean, that's become, I think, much more common, and as things have become much more politicized over the last number of years. So I think that the hope would certainly be that this get concluded by the next presidential election. I think that's really unlikely. I think if DEA may make the decision to reschedule prior to the next election, but I find it very, very difficult to believe that you'd get through notice and comment rulemaking to create an administrative framework for this and sort of finalize the effectuation of this change before January of 2025.
All right. So, Lance, that's a great point that it might take until January 2025 before any rescheduling were to actually occur. But obviously, this is a development that is moving right now, and so we'll have to follow it. In the meantime, Scott, what advice would you have for existing cannabis operators and for folks that are looking in and maybe contemplating entering the cannabis space now? What kind of things should they be doing to prepare themselves best for any possible rescheduling here?
Yeah. Thanks, John. I think, again, I'll reiterate the point that it's never too early to start planning, right? And it particularly if you're coming into this space, I think understanding sort of what the framework looks like right now for you from a federal tax perspective and what it could look like in the future, and being able to bridge that gap in the event that there is a rescheduling of cannabis, and so that you're able to sort of move seamlessly into that new world. And then I think, again, if you're already in the space, presumably you've structured under the current framework, you're going to want to look and see what can I do sort of now, at least, or at least start putting the pieces in place now, so that if it is rescheduled in the future, I'm able to again kind of at least make it less painful if we're going to do something more dramatic to once it's rescheduled to Schedule 3 in the future.
Well, that's it for us today. Thank you for listening. As always, you can find us at dykamapodcast.com. That's DYKEMA podcast.com, youtube.com/Dykema Law, or by searching A Higher Law wherever you get your podcast. Thanks again for listening. My name is John Fraser.
I'm Scott Kociensk.
And I'm Lance Boldrey. We look forward to seeing you next time on A Higher Law.